Before I tell you how I discovered that the family who ignored me in intensive care had also stolen me from another family entirely, let me put you in that room with me for a moment. You are lying flat on a hospital bed in Houston, your right arm immobilized, 3 cracked ribs sending fire through your chest every time you breathe. Your phone is face down on the blanket because you just heard your mother laugh in the background while telling you tonight was not a good time. Her exact words were, "Maya, we are in the middle of your sister's graduation dinner. You always do this." You did not do anything. A driver ran a red light and your car absorbed the impact at 40 miles an hour. But none of that mattered to them. The party mattered. The decorated restaurant table mattered. The photographs mattered. You did not. I lay there in the dark, listening to the monitor count my heartbeats, and I made a decision so cold and so clear it surprised even me. I stopped waiting for them to love me the way I needed. What I did not know was that 2 people were already walking down the hallway toward my room, carrying something that would make every single year of that pain make sense. Before the story gets darker like this video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what city you are watching from. Because betrayal does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it sits at your kitchen table, calls you daughter, and waits for you to stop breathing. My name is Maya Reeves. I am 34 years old. And for 11 years I worked as a licensed structural engineer for a mid-sized firm outside Houston, Texas. I built that career with the kind of focus that leaves very little room for anything else. I studied on weekends when classmates were at parties. I took on extra project loads when senior engineers called in sick. I earned every promotion through hours nobody counted except me. My hands knew drafting tables before they knew how to ask for help. I had my own apartment, my own savings account, my own car, and a reputation at work for being the one you called when a project was quietly falling apart. From the outside, I had done everything right. What people could not see was that I had built all of it to prove something to a family that had never once asked me to prove anything, because they had already decided I was not the daughter worth investing in. My younger sister Danielle was. She always had been. And after a car accident left me alone in a Houston hospital on the night of her graduation dinner, I finally understood just how deep that decision had always run. Danielle was 27 and had just completed her master's degree in communications. She was the version of a daughter my parents could hold up at neighborhood gatherings without having to explain anything. She was warm in the easy way, the kind of warm that costs nothing and earns everything. People adored her. My father called her his sunshine on her birthday every year in a Facebook post that always got 200 likes. My mother planned her events months in advance with spreadsheets and flower sample boards. When Danielle got engaged 2 years earlier, my mother had taken a week off work to handle invitations. When I passed my professional engineering exam, my mother had said, "That is great, Maya," and then asked me to bring a dish to Danielle's birthday brunch the following weekend. The first moment I recognized as something more than ordinary favoritism came at Christmas 3 years ago. I overheard my father tell my uncle that Danielle was the one who had real emotional intelligence, and that I had always been the one who was just difficult to read. He was not whispering. He did not think I was in the hallway. I told myself he meant it as a neutral observation. I was wrong about that. The distance between us grew in steps so small I kept finding reasons to dismiss each one. When I told my mother I had been promoted to project lead, she nodded, and then immediately redirected the conversation to Danielle's new apartment search downtown. I thought she was distracted. When I called home after a difficult week at work, and my father listened for about 90 seconds before saying he had to help Danielle with something, I told myself everyone had bad timing sometimes, but the incidents kept arriving, each one slightly sharper than the last. One Thanksgiving, I cooked for 4 hours while Danielle sat at the table being interviewed by relatives about her career plans as if she were a guest of honor at her own documentary. Nobody asked about my firm. Nobody asked about the bridge project my team had just completed. I was asked twice whether I needed help in the kitchen. The following spring, I found out through a cousin that my parents had quietly co-signed Danielle's new lease and paid her first 3 months of rent. I had moved into my first apartment with $200 and a second-hand mattress. When I gently brought this up to my mother, she said, Danielle needed more support at this stage. I asked what stage I had been at when I moved out alone. She changed the subject. That summer, I stopped being invited to smaller family dinners entirely. Not the big holidays, but the casual Sunday evenings, the birthday restaurant trips, the impromptu gatherings that apparently everyone knew about, except me. When I asked Danielle directly, she looked genuinely confused for about half a second, and then said, "Mum probably just assumed you were busy with work." She assumed it often enough that I stopped hearing about things until after they had already happened. The accident happened on a Thursday in October. I was driving back from a site visit when a driver blew through a red light and hit my passenger side hard enough to spin the car into a guardrail. My right arm took the worst of it. 3 ribs cracked on impact. I was conscious the entire time, which somehow made it worse. By the time I reached the hospital and was stable enough to use my phone, it was 7:40 in the evening. I called my mother first. She answered on the 3rd ring and I could hear the restaurant noise immediately. Voices layered over each other, the clink of glasses, someone giving a toast in the background. I told her I was in the hospital. I told her I had been in a car accident. There was a pause and then she said what she said, that tonight was not a good time, that I always did this, that Danielle's graduation dinner had been planned for months. She asked if I was going to be okay, and before I could fully answer, she said she would call me in the morning. My father did not call at all that night. Danielle sent a text at 10:15 that said, "Hope you feel better. We'll come by when things settle." I read that text 4 times. I was not asking them to rearrange their lives. I was asking them to be my family, while I lay alone and frightened with monitors counting my pulse in a hospital room in a city where nobody knew my name. They chose the dinner. That was when I stopped pretending the pattern was accidental. I did not cry for long. There is a point in certain kinds of pain where emotion simply gives way to clarity, like a fever finally breaking. I lay there looking at the ceiling, and I made a list in my head of every practical thing I could control. In the morning, I called my firm's HR department and arranged emergency leave documentation on my own. I called my neighbor and asked her to water my plants and collect my mail, something my family had not thought to offer. I called my insurance company and began the claim process from my hospital bed while the nurse changed my IV line. Every call I made alone, and every call reminded me that I had always been alone in the ways that actually counted. What I could not have anticipated was that my silence that night, my choice to stop reaching toward people who kept stepping back, would be the thing that finally allowed something true to reach me instead. I was not planning anything. I was only deciding quietly and completely that I was done. 2 investigators came to my room on the 2nd day, a woman named Detective Sandra Okafor and a man named Federal Agent James Tully. They were calm the way people are calm when they are carrying something enormous and have learned to carry it carefully. Detective Okafor placed a photograph on my tray table, a toddler girl, perhaps 18 months old, dark hair, serious expression, a small birthmark visible above her left eyebrow. I touched the side of my own face automatically before I understood why. I have a birthmark in exactly that location. I have had it my entire life. My mother once told me it was hereditary. Agent Tully explained that a routine identity verification triggered by my hospital admission had flagged an inconsistency in my original birth documents. A secondary DNA comparison had been run against a long-standing federal missing persons database. The match was 99.9998%. The little girl in the photograph was named Rose Callahan. She had been taken from a home in Savannah, Georgia, 32 years ago. The couple who had taken her had been employed briefly by the Callahan family as household contractors and had disappeared shortly after Rose vanished. They had resurfaced in Texas under amended paperwork 18 months later with an infant daughter they called Maya. I sat completely still while they told me this. I did not scream. I did not collapse. I simply looked at the photograph and felt 34 years of not quite fitting finally arrange itself into a shape I could read. The arrest came 6 days after my discharge. My parents, the people I had called Mom and Dad since before I had words for anything, were taken from the house I grew up in on a Tuesday morning while the neighborhood watched from driveways. The charges were federal: kidnapping, identity fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. The Callahan family's attorney, a composed woman named Patricia Sohn, had been coordinating with federal prosecutors for 72 hours by the time the handcuffs went on. My biological father, Thomas Callahan, had maintained an active case file for 32 years, updating contact information every time he moved, submitting new DNA samples whenever federal databases expanded. He had never once closed the file. Patricia Sohn looked at me across a conference table 3 days after the arrest and said, "Thomas told me to tell you that he never stopped." I had to look at the wall for a moment after that. Danielle's name appeared in supplementary filings related to financial benefits she had received from assets partially traceable to the original extortion payments made during my disappearance. Her engagement ended. Her professional reputation in Houston's tight-knit event industry evaporated within weeks of the story becoming public. Judge Carla Reyes, presiding over the initial federal hearing, stated on record that the defendants had demonstrated not only criminal intent, but sustained cruelty in their treatment of the victim over 3 decades. That sentence was read to me later by Patricia Sohn, and I asked her to read it twice. Savannah is nothing like Houston. The air moves differently there, slower and heavier, and the streets near the Callahan home are lined with old oak trees that shade everything even at midday. Thomas met me at the airport alone, which I later learned was deliberate. He had asked the rest of the family to wait so I would not be overwhelmed before I had a chance to breathe. He was a quiet man with careful hands and eyes that held grief the way certain rooms hold the smell of something that burned a long time ago. We drove mostly in silence, and I watched Savannah pass the window like a film I had seen in a dream once. My biological mother, Cecile, stood on the front porch when we arrived. She did not rush toward me. She simply held her arms open and waited, and I understood immediately that she had been practicing that exact amount of patience for 32 years. I went inside and sat at a kitchen table that felt nothing like the one I had grown up clearing dishes from. Someone had put a small vase of yellow flowers on the windowsill. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Cecile put coffee in front of me and sat across from me and said nothing at all for several minutes. And it was the most comfortable silence I had ever sat inside. Here is what I know now that I did not know before. Cruelty does not always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as preference, as practicality, as the quiet decision to love one child loudly and another only when convenient. I spent 34 years trying to earn a place in a house where the door had already been closed against me before I was old enough to knock. I used to believe that if I worked harder, asked for less, and caused fewer problems, eventually I would become someone they chose. Now I understand that I was never the problem. I was the proof, and proof is something guilty people will always choose to resent rather than face. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave your city in the comments. It means more than you know. I will see you in the next one.